The scariest and most terrifying things people have ever seen while driving at night. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I was fetching someone from his workplace. I had to go through some fields, and some parts of the road were dark. I saw a thin, long object, wiggling in an upright position at the side of the road in front of me. Totally freaked me out. I thought I was finally experiencing something extraordinary. As I got closer, I realized it was the tail of a cow. It must have escaped from some field and was hanging around at the side of the road. The cow itself was black, the tail slightly lighter in color. That's why I only saw the tail moving first without seeing the whole cow first. When I first started learning to drive, I was working for my dad, and one day after work he asked if I wanted to drive home. I was like, alright. So I got on the highway headed for home, and while driving, I looked in the rear view and a guy on a crotch was coming up behind me. I thought nothing of it. I was sure he would pass or slow down. I look ahead again, and a few moments later I hear this sound, like metal scraping against the ground. I look around and then look back into the rear view, and the bike was on its side, spinning down the highway, and behind it I could see the biker on his back, legs and arms flailing kind of like a baby on its back in a crib. Then I watched as he disappeared under the vehicle behind him. I was so freaked out driving after that I didn't want to drive for weeks following the incident. Then eventually got over it. Still, I can see the guy in my mind just sliding along the ground flailing about being swallowed under another car. Driving home one night from my fiance's house, normal night on the Florida highway. It's pretty dark, not too many lights, cruising at around 75 headed over a slight hill, just big enough that you can't see the other side. Get to the top and start making my way down the hill, and very suddenly, in my headlight view, I get a giant construction vehicle with all of its lights turned off and parked in the left lanes of the highway. I really, seriously, pray to God that no one hit that parked construction vehicle. It was one of the ones that digs up dirt, I think, on the highway that day. I very, very narrowly avoided smacking right into the back of that thing. I don't know how the Cherokee I was driving at the time handled the sharp turn I made into the right lane to avoid the vehicle. Needless to say, I was very nearly dead. I immediately called Florida Highway Patrol and told them about it. I hope they got to it before someone got hurt, and I really hope someone at that construction company lost their job. Because they could have killed multiple people. I drove a taxi during the night shift, and among many crazy and terrifying things, I saw a toddler, 2 to 3 years old. It was about 1 a.m., and I was driving in a very wooded part of our town, just after dropping a customer off, and in the middle of the road was this baby just sitting in the dark. I stopped my cab and turned on my flashers. I proceeded to walk up to the kid, and he just started bawling. I tried to comfort him, but me being in disbelief that a baby with no one around was just sitting there, all I could say was it's cool, bro. I picked him up, and he started crying frantically. I would if a stranger came and grabbed me. I put him in the passenger seat and looked for the nearest driveway. It ended up being about 100 yards down the street. I pulled up into what I hoped was his house, and there were maybe 6 or 7 teenagers drinking in the garage. I couldn't see from the road because all the houses had long dirt driveways. When I pulled up, they acted as if I wasn't even there until I said, "Hey, this your kid?" After a few whats? They came over to the cab and said, "Aiden? Where did you go?" Like the baby just goes for midnight strolls. Not a thank you or goodbye or anything. They just took the baby in the house and continued drinking and laughing. As I pulled out, I felt as if I should call the cops or something but couldn't bring myself to do it. I'm still scared to this day that I'll be driving down a dark road and hit a baby. Back in my 20s, I was putting myself through university by working night shifts at a factory. Money was great, but between full-time work and full-time study, I was constantly exhausted. Sleep got worse when I picked up a second job to make ends meet. Parents split up, and Dad went into depression, so he wasn't working, you see. Anyway, after months, I kept falling asleep at the wheel on the way home from work just before dawn around 4 a.m. one time. As I was driving home all alone after work, I saw half a dozen crocodiles on the road. I swerved to avoid hitting them and almost crashed the car. I was terrified in the moment because they came out of nowhere and were huge, and I'd never seen crocodiles in real life before, let alone on a freeway. I pulled over the car and looked in my rear view mirror, but nothing was there. To this day, I don't know if I dreamed those crocodiles or if they were a hallucination from sleep deprivation. The scariest thing I've ever seen, and I'm so thankful no one was on the road at the time too, was driving from Atlanta, Georgia, to Lexington, South Carolina, with my girlfriend to visit my parents. I like to drive at night since there are fewer people on the road and I can take my time. At around 3 a.m. or so, we are making good time. I had stopped at a gas station and picked up some coffee for us, and we were due in about an hour. GF was sleeping soundly, and I'm listening to a quiet radio humming away. I start getting a little drowsy and take a sip. The road was just as my coffee, no cars in sight except for a spotted few on the side of the road here and there. In the distance I can make out what looks like a hitchhiker, or what I think is one, but can't really tell due to such low light. As I get closer, I start to notice other things, like how the person is kind of thin and tall and completely, for the most part, apparently brown. I'm right up on this thing now, and at about 20 feet it turns around and locks eyes with me as I pass by. This was no person. And it is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. It was a deer. Or I tell myself it was. I have seen deer stand on their hind legs to fight, but they still have deer posture when they do. Not only that, but I was watching this thing walk for about 30 seconds from first seeing it in the distance to passing it. The posture it had was human. Standard biped stance. Arms back, chin down. But the worst part was the eyes, or lack thereof. In their place were two large black pits, almost black hole-ish. I'll never forget the stare down it gave me. The instant I passed it, I had the only panic attack I've ever had in my life. I had to wake up my girlfriend to keep calm enough to get to an exit with a large gas station a few miles away. Like hell, I was going off a ramp close to that thing. After we pulled into the station, I had a complete meltdown. I started crying harder than I ever thought I could. I couldn't talk, breathe, or do anything but want to curl into a ball and cry. After around 30 minutes or so, she finally gets me to calm down enough to tell her what happened. While I don't think she believed what I think I saw, she knew that I was convinced and legitimately scared to death. Every once in a blue moon I will dream about it and wake up crying or in a cold sweat, and she will tease me about it or roll over and ignore me instead of comforting me about the one thing that I've ever been terrified of. But I know what I saw, and I know it will haunt me for the rest of my life. 1978 or 79. I was the lead singer/guitarist of a punk band called the Nads. Punk was new to Vermont and roundly hated in an era of overblown bands issuing albums of overly instrumented 14-minute pieces. We were three poor kids with second-hand equipment and few gigs. We were also the owners of an ancient Thames van that had previously served a plumber. His name was still faintly visible on the sides despite many scrubbings. Anyway, we traveled up and down Vermont and also made trips to New Hampshire and Maine, playing where we could. We got a gig playing at a basement bar in Portland, Maine, but the pay would cover not much more than the gas. We gassed up, packed 2 days worth of sandwiches and a change of underwear, and off we went. Just over the border in Maine, we blew a tire since it was a Thames. It was still afternoon, and there was a garage/gas station nearby, so we took the tire off and walked it over to see if they could repair it. The spare was bald as hell and probably wouldn't have gotten us home. The road was narrow and in pretty rough shape, and we walked along in our all-black attire and our unfortunate haircuts. The reaction we got from the locals at the station was shock, but we had cash, and away we drove. About 20 miles further, the same tire flattened again, and we figured that we had been had. We were in an even more rural area, and this was the time before cell phones, so we were fucked. Night closed in. We had food to eat and plenty of forest to pee in, so we just waited for a good Sumerian or at least daybreak. Sorry, bar that took a chance on us. We lounged around inside the van and played around a bit on a new song we were writing. Then ate and tried to sleep. Deep in the night, we heard the screeching of metal being dragged along asphalt, and we bolted upright and peered out the windshield. There a snowmobile was racing along the June road, shooting off sparks behind it like a comet. One guy was driving and another guy was, well, surfing behind it on something that looked like a piece of farm machinery while he clung desperately to a rope tow line. Comet lingered in our eyes as the two disappeared around a wooded corner. We didn't say anything for a long while until Bill, our drummer, blurted out, "You guys need to write a song about that shit." And so Wrenchhead Surfing was written. One time I was going to my friends a few towns over. Most of the drive is a pretty straight road with a few stops and has a speed limit of 45, so everyone does 55 usually. It's about 8 o'clock and dark out, and I get stuck behind a slow car doing about 35 miles per hour. It's frustrating, but I'll pass at the next passing zone. Next thing I know, he goes even slower, down to 20 miles per hour. I think maybe he feels me too close to him, so I back off his bumper, and he speeds up to 45. Soon he slows back down again. Then speeds back up. Then it slows again. But this time he comes to a stop. In the middle of the road. No one else around. No stop sign. I decide to fuck this and slowly start going around him. And I remember wanting to look over, but as I was going by him, I started accelerating. Then he lays on his horn and starts accelerating. So I put the pedal down even more, trying to pass him. He is still lying on his horn. I am freaking out, so I just accelerating harder. Finally, we are up to 80 miles per hour in the opposite lane before he slows off. I keep going, wanting to put some distance on us. Coming to the end of the road is an intersection with traffic lights. Light turns red. Guy is still behind me. I grab an ice scraper from the backseat to get ready for him to get out and come to my truck. Thankfully, nothing happens. I turned at the intersection, and he keeps going. Crisis advertised, but I was still shaking when I got to my friend's house. This is the only experience I have ever had like this. Nothing else has come close. Some friends and I, 5 of us, are driving around some rural roads waiting for a friend to arrive at his girlfriend's house. We were just kind of wasting time, cruising down some dirt roads around 20 miles an hour, talking. My friend who is driving slams on his brakes and I, in the passenger seat, looked up, and there was this thing. I had never seen anything like it before. We stopped the car and watched as this thing, which didn't have a perceivable head, moved slowly across the road, about 15 feet in front of us. It was creepy, to say the least. It was approximately 4 feet tall, and we could see its joints moving as it walked slowly with a gait similar to a giraffe. It had very skinny, long legs. Its body was about 1.5 feet round. If it had hair, it was pretty short, but the thing was brown. We were all screaming, "What the fuck is that?" We could not see any perceivable head, and it was walking perpendicular to us. We watched as it slowly walked through these people's yard and behind their house. Needless to say, we were freaking out about it. When we got to my friend's house, we all drew pictures of it separately and showed each other at the same time when we were done to verify that we all saw what we saw. It was the strangest thing I have ever seen, and I have not found any satisfactory explanation to this day, 20 years later. Me and my mom, stepdad, stepbrother and stepsister were coming home from dinner. My mom was driving, and it was a huge highway that stretches through most of my city. She was driving the speed limit. It was a known speed trap, and when the car in front of us goes to change lanes, another car comes in at like 80 miles per hour and wrecks the car in front of us and then drives away. My mom pulls over just in front of the car and calls the cops. 10 minutes later, they arrive and suspect a drunk driver caused the accident. It was so scary because we were close to the car, and if he hadn't changed lanes, then we could have been hit. The driver was okay, and we saw the drunk driver's license plate, so he was caught and fined. I had a weird and somewhat frightening experience one night years ago while on a long, dark road one night. I was in the Navy at the time, and I was on a training trip to Groton, Connecticut. I was quite the partier in younger days, and I would wander damn near anywhere wherever I thought there was some music, dancing, and action, wink wink. One night I decided to wander somewhere north of the New London/Groton area to see what else was out there. Well, I didn't see anything worth mentioning, so I said screw it and finally turned my rental car around to head back to the base. Now let me set the scene as it really was. I was just driving along this long, dark highway when I spotted a white guy just standing there in the pitch darkness alone and alongside the road. There was no car or anything there. It was just him. As a southerner, my first impulse was to ask if he was okay, that is, until I looked into his eyes. This man looked me right in the eye, and his stare sent a damn chill through me as I drove by. He actually had the look of something between a spirit and an outright axe murderer. I mean, this dude didn't even look real. He didn't say a word to me, and he made no physical gesture. He just stared at me with this evil, weird, and ghostly look in his eyes. Bottom line is this, he scared the shit out of me, so I kept my black ass moving and got the fuck out of there as fast as possible. I was even afraid that I was going to have bad dreams that night. That's just how evil and weird this cat looked. This incident happened about 35 years ago, and I never forgot about it, so I hope this puts the story into a better perspective in terms of the Jason effect this dude had on me. Was driving from a mid-size road onto a residential street. As I'm going to make my left turn, North America, so crossing oncoming traffic, I noticed something in the middle of the road in the crosswalk that I didn't recognize. I turned and drove around it. As I do, I realize it's a guy in a wheelchair tipped over. This was on my way home from being DD, and we went to McDonald's, so guy was there a while. I stopped, got out, and uprighted the extremely thankful gentleman. He was worried he'd be too heavy for just me. Being a drunk passenger wasn't much help, but I got it done. Not a hazard I've ever thought of as a non-handicapped person. I hoped my good karma would be passed forward. In my early 20s, I used to drive a lot. I was extremely depressed, so I'd just drive and drive as therapy. I couldn't afford it, but it made me feel better, so whatever. One night, I was driving some back roads on one of those summery nights where the air cools down much quicker than the pavement and a super thick fog was hanging right by the ground. It was past midnight, so it was pitch black. In the middle of nowhere, I couldn't see 3 feet in front of my car, and the road was surrounded very closely by thick woods. So I'm going at a fairly slow pace because of the lack of visibility, pondering my life choices, and getting wigged out. Then wham, this incredibly loud bang right the fuck next to my head. A fucking owl flew into my window. He must have been going a damn good clip because dude was toast. Scared the ever-living shit out of me, and I booked it home. I was driving home at like 10 p.m., still light out, down a road that's famous for deer running across and dying. I went past a group of deer, a couple of them were watching me, and a couple of them were running alongside the road. When I looked out my window at the ones running alongside the road, there was one that looked starved, and its ribs were all visible through its skin, but its skin was also rotting, and you could see the flesh and muscles underneath. I am a very squeamish person, and this almost had me throwing up in my car. Look out for the zombie deer in NKY, it's been spotted by some classmates too. Update, the deer doesn't have CWD, they have already gotten reports about it, and they found the deer. According to Fish and Wildlife, the deer just has some really bad warts. I really don't believe it, but maybe that deer's warts eat away at its skin or it got mangled when it got hit by a car. A ditch and hedge when we were expecting a straight piece of road. Let me just open by saying this was a really stupid idea, and please don't ever attempt this. My friend and I were driving back to his house late at night. It was dark and foggy with very poor visibility. Both of us had only just passed our driving tests. The roads were small country roads with steep ditches and hedges on both sides, and you seldom met anyone else on them, especially at that time of night. Somehow the conversation turned to the ability to end up at your destination without remembering how you got there. Fair enough, we'd heard people talk about this before. This escalated into how far do you think you could drive with the headlights off in the pitch black on a road that you drive daily? Theory was quickly put into practice. Now, as a passenger in the car, I can say it was both exciting and terrifying, but my 17-year-old self clearly had no clue of the dangers involved in the experiment we were about to undertake. The first trial went well. Lights went off for what felt like minutes but was probably only 5 to 6 seconds. When the lights came back on, we were still in the middle of the road, pretty good for a first attempt. The second time we thought we'd try for a longer blackout, we were feeling confident. The atmosphere was somewhat tense in the car, but you could feel the adrenaline building the longer the lights stayed off and the car remained in motion. After what seemed like an eternity, my friend put the lights back on. Now instead of a nice straight piece of tarmac, we were greeted with the sight of a rapidly approaching grass verge behind which was a steep ditch and a hedge. We both screamed very loudly as my friend slammed on the brakes and attempted to turn away from the impending collision. The car clipped the verge and skidded to a halt in the middle of the road. Neither of us spoke. After a few minutes, my friend drove the rest of the way home, lights very much on. The only words spoken were from my friend, who said, "We should probably not mention this to anyone." I just nodded in silence. It has to be one of the stupidest things I've ever been party to. This was when I was about 12. I remember early on a Sunday my mother getting a phone call and telling us that an elderly neighbor had passed away in the night. We all said the usual stuff, that it was sad and we'd have to call down to the wake the next day, etc. Later that evening, we went to visit my grandmother and stayed until it was pretty late. We drive home in pitch black darkness. This was in rural Ireland, so silent, windy little roads through woodland, a house only every 4 or 5 miles. We're almost home when we see something in the headlights in front of us. For a minute, we couldn't make it out, but eventually the outline of the figure walking towards us emerged, the elderly neighbor who had died the night before. We all went silent. He tipped his hat to us, and I just remember my dad putting the foot down to get home faster. It turns out it was a different feckin' neighbor that had died. Scared the shit out of us until we found that out the next morning, though. Not at night but at 4 o'clock in the morning when it was pitch black. I was driving to my college orientation by myself, and I was still a rather inexperienced driver when it came to driving outside of my county. I took the wrong exit on an interstate, and my GPS told me to follow the road that it let me out on for 2 miles to make a U-turn at the roundabout. It's pitch black, and I'm driving down this narrow road in the middle of woods. Nothing but trees on either side. There are no cars on the road but me, and I was thinking about how spooky it was, but I always blast my music so I don't get paranoid about that shit. I go around a curve, and instantly have to slam on the brakes and swerve to avoid a giant piece of metal blocking only my lane. I cross the double yellow, but I could see nobody was coming, and I did it safely. Shaken up, I kept driving towards the roundabout. It was about another minute. I turn around, still scared about what just happened, and I know to slow down in case there's a car in my lane going around the object on my way back. As I approach the spot, with absolutely no cars in sight, and nothing but trees around the road, I see a man in a black hoodie and black pants hunched next to the piece of metal in the road, like he was rearranging it in a better spot. I floored it and went 60 down that tiny road until I found the interstate again and got back on. Was driving on Route 27, a Costa Rican highway from the Pacific coast to the capital. It was about midnight, the street had a curve, so we could not see far away. The windows were down, so we were able to hear a big boom and tires screeching. After the curve there was a big straight bit, far into it we could see a big seafood truck going really fast. 10 seconds later we see a broken bike, then I realized just ahead is a ripped human leg laying on the street. Called 911 knowing I was about to find the rest of the body somewhere. I park and get some light reflectors out so nobody would run over the leg and cause another accident. As soon as I do it, I hear moaning coming from the bushes on the side of the road. When I get there, I see an old man, laying face down, around 60 to 70 years/old, blood everywhere. He was trying to say something while dying, but all I could make out was esposa, which means wife but also could mean handcuffed depending on context. Now, I don't get disgusted by boot or a lot of things, so knowing he was going to die either way, I try to turn him, grabbing from his shoulder to lay him with his face up. This failed since his abdomen skin had been ripped open and all his guts slid out. Between the smell that came off and the scene I had just seen, I could not resist the nausea and puked more than I had eaten in a month. Shortly after, the police came and declared him dead on scene. Then the ambulance came and took him away. I stayed since I was curious and got asked to be a witness. A lot of people had gathered around by this point, and we started looking for parts of the car, helping the police. A guy found a piece of the bumper with a number plate. An officer told me the car had been reported stolen, but I found it weird since. Who would want to steal a car full of fish? So I checked the time I called 911 and showed the officer, and funny to be told, the car had been reported stolen 8 minutes after I called 911. Months after a friend told me the guy that died was found with alcohol in his system and the driver was charged only for filing a false stolen car. Hopefully this doesn't get buried, but once when I was around 20, 36 now, I was driving to meet up with some friends. It was a Saturday morning, around 1:00-ish, so there weren't too many cars out. As I make a left at the end of my street, a car has made a left from the main road onto the road I was on, so we are on a straight path to pass each other. As the car was coming up, I noticed the driver had an unusually white head, as in white, not white person. As we passed each other, we were both driving slower, and as I got up next to the car, it was a skull. At first I thought it was a mask, but the skull turned and looked at me. When he did, his eyes were wide open, and then he opened his mouth at me. At the time, it scared the living hell out of me, but looking back at it now, it had to be some top-of-the-line mask the driver was wearing. It would probably still scare me though if I wasn't expecting it. On patrol, she stayed OT and was driving back through rural Ontario to go off duty. I come over the old train tracks at about 105 km/h northbound, in a 90 km/h zone, and just over the crest of the tracks, on the north side, a small baby just sitting there, no one around. Slammed on my brakes and hit all my lights so anyone coming before I got back there would stop, no other cars around, but you never know. They were the only house in sight, so me and my racing heart and this baby head there. It turns out she got out of her crib and wandered out through a door that had been propped open because her dad was moving wood inside to work on a renovation. Somehow avoided detection and wound up approximately 150 meters down the road. Very nice family, unfortunate incident that could have been much worse. Of course children's aid had to be called, etc. The thought of what could have happened still gives me goosebumps. Dude burst out of the woods completely naked and made noise beyond screaming. We were driving maybe 35 km/h at the time due to us just coming around a bend in the dark, and we see this figure tearing out of the woods on the driver's side of the road. Headlights hit this man butt naked, covered in what appeared to be blood, and they caught his eyes in that reflective freaky state. The noise that came out of his mouth could be called a scream, but that would not do it justice. The most ungodly thing I have ever heard, and considering we were in a car with all the windows up, it must have been obscenely loud because it was like it could have been coming from inside the car. This was in '96, and I still have dreams where he runs out from somewhere dark and makes that sound to this day. Driving home from work at about 3 a.m., along country roads in Wiltshire, England. I missed my turn, went along to the next one, and looking at the sat-nav, it connected to the main road I was heading for, so I took it. It was a single-track road, so I was driving slowly. I saw something smallish in the middle of the road, and as I got closer, I saw it was a bird, a pigeon. It was dead and had blood on it, so I assumed it had been run over, but as I looked, I realized the blood was on its chest, and it didn't seem squashed. I drove past it, swerving the wheel so as not to squish it, and carried on a short way before I saw another pigeon in the road. Same deal, dead, bloodied, not squashed, like it had been shot with an air gun or similar. Further up the road, more pigeons, all dead, in small piles of 2 or 3 of them, all in the middle of the road. I slowed down and had my lights on full beam staring at a pile of dead birds when suddenly a bird smashed against the windscreen, then another, and another against the side window. I freaked and floored it, hammered up the road through several more piles of birds whilst my wipers smeared blood all over the windshield. A bird was lodged at the bottom of the windshield, and when I got to the main road, I had to pull over and remove it, not before I'd put a few miles between myself and the person who was apparently killing pigeons and throwing them at me in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. I guess some kind of hot fuzz style cult or Masonic ritual involving local landowners impregnating animals and sacrificing kids, etc. I didn't hang around to find out though. When I was 18, I was driving my boyfriend home around 2 a.m. when we came up on a pickup truck on fire. The driver had crashed head-on into a massive tree, and the driver's door was crushed against a fence. I called 911, and we started trying to get him out, but the front of the truck was completely smashed. The engine was basically on his knees, and his legs were completely trapped. I remember climbing into the cab of the truck and reaching for him, and there was so much fire I couldn't even see his face, just an arm in a red and white striped hoodie. He must have been unconscious when we got there, but when I started screaming, so did he. I regret it now, because I wish he'd stayed unconscious as he died. A guy in a suit pulled me out of the cab, and then suddenly there were first responders and other people everywhere. I didn't look when the firefighters pulled the body out, but my boyfriend said it was a head and torso, then just nothing below. I used to take that street to work every day, but I quit for years. I moved to another city for 4 years, and when I moved back and drove down that street for the first time, I could still see the burn damage on the tree he'd hit. I never managed to find out any information about the guy, but I looked for months afterward. I still think about it almost every day, almost 10 years later. I wish I could have saved his life. My friend and I were driving from one beach town to the other. It was midnight. The light turned green, and the oncoming car, a Volkswagen GT, cuts in front of us and makes a left turn onto the wrong way side of the freeway ramp and pins it. We slowly go straight over a bridge, about 300 to 500 feet, and slow down to watch this guy flying down the wrong side of the highway. He makes it about 2,000 feet and collides head-on. Collided with another sedan. They hit so square that both their tail ends bucked upwards. We both look at each other like what the fuck. My buddy yelled at me to call 911, and I did. It was a short phone conversation. I got a call back a week later from the police asking a few more questions, and I asked what happened to them, and she said both the drivers died. The lady who called me from the police said we were the only witnesses. 23 years old was the wrong way driver. This was scary at the time but probably doesn't seem scary if you didn't experience it. I guess it's more about what I couldn't see than something I did see. Driving from Southern California to Arkansas, my dad and I had been on the road for about 16 or so hours, maybe closer to 20. He had been insisting we stop and rest, and I kept swearing I felt fine to drive and he could sleep while I drove. He complained he couldn't sleep in the car, but I didn't want to stop, so we kept going. We were in the Texas Panhandle somewhere, in the middle of nowhere, and it was pitch black in all directions except for occasional headlights and streetlights, close to midnight. No moon, cloudy night, so no stars, and all I could see was the road stretching about 100 feet in front of me, and that's it. I couldn't see the landscape around me at all. As I drove, I started to feel like I was driving on an incline. I kept driving, and it felt like I was going further and further uphill, steeper and steeper of an incline. I couldn't see the landscape around me, but I remembered Texas being mostly flat, so nothing felt right about it, but I wasn't going to say anything to Dad, or I'd have to admit he was right. I keep driving, feeling like I'm climbing higher and higher, knowing I can't see the road more than 100 feet ahead of me, and I get this terrible fear that we are going to hit a bend in the highway and I'm going to careen over the side of the embankment to our doom. I'm stressed to the point that my knuckles are white on the steering wheel, and finally we come around a slight bend with a bunch of extra streetlights, and I can see the landscape around us as flat land for miles in any direction. I was never on any kind of slope at all, the whole thing was just my brain fucking with me in the dark. We pulled over at the next stop and got a hotel. Nothing really happened, but for about half an hour I was convinced we were just seconds away from driving over the side of a cliff. There's a lot of deer in my town despite living in a fairly suburban area, and near my house is a large stretch of private wooded land in the middle of town. It's not uncommon for there to be dead animals running along this stretch of land. One afternoon, while on my way to work, I see that one of the city deer was hit and killed on the side of the road. It's happened before, so I just drive on. The deer stayed there for a few days. A few nights later, I'm having dinner at my boyfriend's house. I ended up staying late and finally went home sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. It's completely dark out, and I'm driving past this stretch of private land when all of a sudden, in my lights, I see a fucking balloon floating on the side of the road. Now this wasn't during the clownpocalypse, but my immediate thought was Stephen King level clown bullshit. Scared me half to death until I realized that someone had tied a get well soon balloon onto that dead deer. The very first night I got my driver's license, I was driving home. The street I lived on was a 15-mile-per-hour one-way, kind of a service-style road with woods on both sides. There were apartments to the left and a main road to the right, with this little narrow one-way road between with woods on each side. It was always kind of disorienting because it was hidden off of a main street, so you go from traffic and lights to basically dark-ass woods. So I'm driving, and a man comes out of the woods and stands in the road. I slam on the brakes and notice he is covered in what looks like blood. He walks up to my car and slams his hands on my hood and looks at me before walking into the woods on the other side of the road. I had my roommate's dog in the back seat, a pit bull mix, and the dog is growling and going crazy. I panic. Foot on the gas as hard as I can, I'm shaking and crying, and I run into my apartment and tell my roommate, who thinks it is a prank, until he sees bloody handprints on the hood of my car. He went to a neighbor to call the police, way before cell phones, ends up dude had stabbed his girlfriend in one of the apartments and was trying to run from the police. Having the dog in the car probably stopped him from trying to carjack me, etc. I had nightmares for a while after that. I was driving from my hometown to the town I was studying in. Time was something between 1 and 3 a.m. On the side of the road, I saw a woman waving at me, and I slowed down next to her. Say looked kind of messed up, and I immediately thought that if I stop, a gang is going to come from the woods and fuck me up. I still stopped because she could be in danger or something. As a matter of fact, she was, and when she came into the passenger seat, I saw that he had a wound on her forehead. She was pretty confused, and she said that she's not sure but thinks she was robbed, she had been unconscious and woke up without her phone, etc. I dropped her off at the nearest hospital and answered a few questions from the staff. A few weeks later, the lady thanked me through Facebook. So nothing really scary actually happened, but the moment I found her was pretty unsettling. Not exactly me driving, but when I was 12, I was walking on the sidewalk and saw a white truck going about 5 miles per hour behind me, slowing down but never passing me. I was about 10 houses away from my house in the neighborhood. At this point I'm getting scared because the truck is about 5 feet from me, so I start running. The truck speeds up and gets in front of me, so I panic and act like a random house was mine and run to a door. I know it wasn't the best thing to do, but I'd rather take my chances running into a random stranger's house. By the time I was at a neighbor's door, the guy was out of his car running to me. Luckily the door was unlocked, and I ran in, and the people that lived there called the cop, and he sped up. Apparently later that day the truck was spotted sitting by a school. I was driving to work early one morning, before dawn, and it was raining steadily. A late 90s Firebird Trans Am coming in the opposite direction came across the median, hit the car 2 up from me, spun 180, and then the truck in front of me ran into the Firebird's rear end. I got out to help with the injured. The guy in the truck couldn't move, and we didn't want to move him. The people in the first car were up and okay. When we looked in the Firebird, there was no driver. No one in the front seats. The dude was all the way in the back, squished up against the rear window. He woke and was able to climb out, quite shaken. I bet he wishes he'd had his seatbelt on. Apparently he'd fallen asleep, that's all it takes. It was all very intense, and it happened so fast. I stayed long enough to give a report and left. Never heard anything on the accident after that. When I was young, my family would drive across the country to visit my grandparents for a few days, have a gathering at my uncle's house on Christmas Eve, then haul us back across the US for Christmas Day. I remember we were on the highway, and I was playing Mario Tennis on my DS when my mom swerved to avoid a drunk driver who came from the other side of the highway. I looked and saw them collide with another car head on, and both cars just fucking exploded. One of the cars rolled in front of another car, which caused it to swerve and fall off the cliff the highway was on, maybe like a 20-foot drop. It was like an Indiana Jones scene. I don't remember much after that, and I don't know what happened after to those involved. I'll look and see if I can find anything. My boyfriend and I left the bar at about 2 a.m. and were driving about 10 minutes away to a food truck to get some sandwiches. You have to go down this street that is a main street, but the town isn't super great, and at night it's pretty deserted and ill-lit. Anyways, we were coming up to a red light on that road, and a large man walks slowly into the road in front of us, stops in the middle of the lane, and turns to stare at us. My boyfriend slowed down even more. We were maybe about 20 feet away at this point. Instead of stopping though, my boyfriend sped up and drove around him and through the red light, could see no cars coming, and kept going. He had me call the police, and he drove to the food truck a minute or two away. I grew up in very safe areas and didn't really consider the consequences of what might have happened had we stopped. We got our food after I got off the phone with the police, and we had to go back down that road in order to get home, but the road has a town center in the middle of it so we could see the spot where the man was but not actually have to drive by him. As we approached the spot, we saw the guy. We saw police cars there and 5 or 6 officers pulling guys out of the bushes, and the large gentleman was cuffed on the sidewalk. Not my story, but my sister's. This was years ago. She was probably in her mid-20s and was a bartender. Naturally, she got out of work around 1 a.m. and was driving home. As she's driving by this cemetery, one of those giant, really nice, and really well-kept cemeteries, a woman runs out into the middle of the road with blood pouring from some unseen injury on her head. Like this woman is covered in blood. My sister stops and cracks the window a teeny tiny bit because she's thinking that she's about to get jumped and kidnapped. The woman is incoherently asking for help and freaking out. My sister is absolutely terrified at this point, but calls 911. She never gets out of the car. Police, fire, and EMT show up and treat the lady. The woman legitimately was just taking a stroll in the cemetery at night, fell and hit her head pretty badly, and flagged down whoever was passing by. The woman was fine, and obviously it was legitimate and thankfully didn't go the way of human trafficking, but my sister says it was still one of the scariest things that's ever happened to her. I was on a very rural, 2-lane, unlit road through cornfields somewhere in Georgia for about 6 hours on a road trip from Massachusetts to Nashville, Tennessee. It was about 3 a.m., and I was getting pretty tired. My partner was asleep in the back, so I was kind of alone. I was driving a newer Lincoln with the blind spot assist in the mirrors, which basically tells you when there's an object near the back right or back left of the vehicle. After about 5 hours on this road, we lost cell service, so the music I was streaming stopped and even the GPS in the car stopped working, so it showed our location but there was no map overlay. Really weird, but I didn't think anything of it because I knew I'd be on the road for a super long time just going straight. There was a bit of fog, but it didn't really make it hard to see the road ahead. The road was pretty straight and wide, speed limit was 50 miles per hour, so I was only worried about other vehicles or obstacles in the road, but there was literally 1 or 2 other vehicles on the road the entire time. I hit a patch of fog that got pretty thick, so I slowed down to around 25 to 30 miles per hour. A minute or two into the denser fog, both blind spot monitor lights lit up solid. They would stay on for about 5 to 10 seconds and go off and then come on again. I was checking the mirrors and couldn't see much because of the fog, and there were obviously no cars near me, so I was a little confused. The fog was getting more and more dense at this point, so I had slowed down to nearly crawl. With no warning, the road turned into a bridge, which I can only assume was going over some small river. I literally couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of the car, so I had no idea what was in the road ahead. As soon as we were past the bridge, the fog completely cleared, but the blind spot monitors kept flashing on and off. I'm not sure if it was me being tired and not thinking straight, but the only thing I could think of was that something was following/chasing the car, staying perfectly in the blind spots the whole time. I kept seeing glimpses of things passing in the mirrors, and my heart was beating super fast. I was in full fight or flight mode. My partner woke up and asked where we were. I looked down, and the GPS was back to normal, and the music started playing from my phone. Blind spot mirrors were back to normal. Nothing bad ended up happening, but I was really creeped out by the whole thing. I tracked our trip with Google Maps, and I was never able to find the bridge that we passed over, so I'm not even sure that the fog part even happened or if I was just so tired that I imagined it. Pretty vivid memory of being creeped the fuck out though. Was driving from South Carolina to Maryland on I-95 in June a few years back to visit family friends. I was meeting my parents and sister there. They left earlier that day, but I had to work until 6 p.m., so I didn't leave until around 8 p.m. Now, anyone who has driven I-95 can tell you that there are long stretches of nothing, small towns, and more nothing, interspersed with the occasional city. It's the middle of nowhere, Last town was 10 miles back, around 9:30 p.m., and it's raining so hard I can barely see the road. I slow down and pull over to the right shoulder as soon as possible. I lock the doors, throw the car in park, and prepare to wait out the rain. The rain eases off after about 10 minutes, and I get ready to get on the road again when I notice something weird off in the trees to the side. It looks like a pile of black trash bags with white sticks poking out. Oh. I call the cops. Then, I call my parents and tell them I'm going to be late, I'll call them later, don't worry, etc. It took the state troopers almost an hour to get there. They were responding to a bunch of traffic accidents with fatalities, and this wasn't a priority. In the meantime, I've worked myself into a state of panic, thinking I've stumbled upon a serial killer's dump site and I'm about to be killed for discovering the body, because I watch entirely too many procedurals, and it really isn't good for my anxiety. Sled gets there, takes one look, yep, that is a human skull. They start processing the scene, take my statement, tell me they'll be in touch, and send me on my way. It is now almost 1 a.m., my parents are frantic. I called them, reassured them, and told them I would see them the next day. Then I turned my car around and went back. To my knowledge, they've never identified the body that was in those bags. They probably never will. Whilst driving from Morelia to Ciudad Hidalgo, in Mexico, back in the 80s we had two ways to get to Ciudad Hidalgo, which was the National Road or the Old National Road, which was called Mil Cumbres. Mil Cumbres basically means 1,000 curves. That stretch of road literally had 1,000 curves, so a lot of people would get motion sickness when on that road. One evening on our way back to my grandparents, who lived in Ciudad Hidalgo, my grandfather was driving, and he loved taking Mil Cumbres because it had really nice views, and he just really loved driving that road, but since we had the new National Road, not a lot of people use that road anymore, so it was kind of desolate with the exception of passing one or two little towns. It was dusk so soon that meant that being on such a desolate road in the mountains, we would be in complete darkness on the road with not many other cars on the same stretch of road. It took 2 hours to get to the town on that road, so maybe 45 minutes into the drive it had already gotten really dark, and as we were driving my grandfather started slowing down. I was sitting in the back seat because my grandmother was in the front with my grandfather, so I kind of stood over the front chairs to see why he was slowing down. That's when I saw a hug tree log blocking the road. My grandfather came to a stop and immediately started going in reverse to turn around and get out of the car. After we turned, my grandfather stepped on the gas pedal, and I was sort of thrown back into the back seat. I immediately turned around to see if I could anything, and as we were speeding away, I could see men, very dimly since the light from the tail lights from the car was starting to get dimmer and dimmer, coming from out of the adjacent trees next to the tree log on the road, with flashlights and guns. We were about to get robbed, and thanks to my grandfather's quick thinking and taking action immediately, we avoided it. That was the last time I was ever on that road. 1991, driving some friends in college from Phoenix to the Grand Canyon. We left around 11 p.m., and I was driving because I was sober. Somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, I see a headlight coming up behind me. Now I was driving fast, around 85, but this light was coming up to me like I was standing still. As it gets closer, I wake my friends up and have them check the back windows. We decide it's best for me to pull over, but before I can, the light is on top of us and then passes over us. As I pull onto the shoulder, we jump out of the car and see this black bat/manta ray-like thing bank over us in the moonlight. Freaked us out. A few years later, I saw a picture of a stealth bomber. Yep. That was the thing that buzzed us. Pilots must have been having the time of their lives. I used to commute roughly 50 miles for work every day. I would get on the freeway and sit in traffic in the morning, but by the evening I'd take a different route home. It took longer, but it was free sailing through the countryside, and I could blast music going 80 down the freeway. One night, as I'm pulling out of the parking lot at work, I notice some headlights come on behind me and pull out with me some distance back. At first, I thought it was just a customer who had stuck around for a few minutes after we closed, not uncommon. But a while later I noticed those same headlights behind me on the freeway. The whole way. And when they pulled off the freeway at the same time I did, I started to get nervous. So I took them on a little joyride, going round town in circles basically. They didn't budge. It was only about 9 p.m., so I looked for somewhere with a lot of people hanging around. Thankfully, there was an AM/PM that was super busy at the time. I pulled into the only available slot like I was getting gas and just sat there. I turn around, and lo and behold, the car had pulled in after me and was idling, but after they realized there was nowhere for them, they started to turn around and leave. When they pulled past me, I saw the driver and the passenger, and they were both just fucking staring me down. This guy and a girl honestly looked like meth heads to me, and I couldn't stop thinking that these two fuckers were going to follow me home and fucking kill me. I waited at the gas station for like an hour just trying to calm myself down. Back in Delaware when I was younger, I had gone with a friend to visit her extended family for a week. Fields of crops everywhere, a military base nearby, and I think it was 1 hour or something like that from the state capital, Dover. These people were a deep-rooted military family but were really chill about a lot of stuff. The one exception was being alone at night. They constantly had us stay in groups of 3 or more, which wasn't hard. One day one of her older cousins took us for some ice cream later in the evening, so it was pitch black out except for the few and scattered street lights. We're in the back seat and his boyfriend in the front seat with a mildly worried look, and we thought it was because we took forever. The ride to the ice cream place was 45 minutes, and we took a half hour to get our cone and eat it. Well, her cousin, named Elliot, begins to start speeding down this long stretch of road, the longest one in our trip to and from their home. We start to narrowly miss animals running in front of the truck. It's really dark out though, so I couldn't really make out what animals they were. I'm too busy fiddling with my armrest to really care, but my friend is looking like she was going to freak. We kept seeing red pinpricks out in the fields, often seeing them disappear as soon as we reached a lantern. His boyfriend grips his armrest really tightly but turns to tell us not to look out the windows if the animals were freaking her out. My friend asks, "Why are we going so fast?" Elliot chimes in, "This stretch is bad." Then I asked, "Why is it bad?" His boyfriend turned around and made eye contact with us for the first time that night. Both of us stopped fidgeting and froze at his sudden action. He looked at both of us before he let out his breath. "It's not about hitting them things in front of us out there," he said with a really serious tone. I tease about what's chasing us from behind. The chilling idea of something potentially happening kept us still, especially after Elliot nodded in agreement. As if on cue, a slight growl from behind the vehicle and an audible fuck from Elliot made the truck lurch forward even faster. We all look at the back of the pickup and see a pair of bright red dots begin to fade as Elliot slams on the gas pedal. My friend and I hold each other despite the seatbelts and begin to silently tear up. We left 2 days later with absolutely no clue what his boyfriend meant with that, nor what the fuck made that growl behind the vehicle going 50 plus an hour. My thought later on was that it was an older vehicle roaring down the road in the opposite direction. Who knows, it was the single most scary shit I ever lived in a car. Was driving home from work when I was in college. It was about 2:30 a.m. I lived in the mountains just above a sleepy beach/college town. I'm 3/4 home on this winding mountain road when I come around a corner and see a car had sideswiped a telephone pole. The car bounced off and is in the middle of the road. I back my car up so it's obvious before the corner and get out and run to the car. Its passenger side is crumpled, and the driver's side is mostly fine. I realize the telephone pole is somehow broken and then collapses back onto itself. It looks super unstable. But my focus is mostly on the car. When I look in the car, there are 2 20-ish-year-old girls inside. As I look in, the driver, a brunette, comes to and looks at me, and then at her friend. A petite blood girl, she looks perfectly peaceful, but not moving, the car pressing in on her. The driver starts to scream and yell and is freaking out. I tell her not to move, that she could be hurt. To try and calm down and focus on me. I get her door open and tell her we need to get her out and out of the road, it's not safe. She calms a bit. I get her seatbelt off and pull her out. She has a bit of a limp as she tries to stand, and I just quickly pick her up and run off the side of the road and lay her down in the dirt. I tell her to try not to move, that she could be injured. She insists I check on her friend. I agree. At this time, 2 more cars come behind mine. The first guy comes behind me and takes over, trying to calm the driver. The second guy comes up half a minute later and quickly says, "I'm an off-duty cop, are you the driver?" Thank the gods. I fill him in, he says to follow him. We go to his car, and he pulls out a maglite, a professional first aid kit, and rubber gloves. We go to the car, and he crawls over to the blonde girl. He tells me to go to the passenger side and shine the light on her. He starts checking for vitals. It's then I realize she's blue, motionless, and likely not with us anymore. She's very pretty, is what I think in my head, and young. It's so depressing. He's trying to cut her seatbelt. I don't think he can move her with the door pressing on her. Then behind me, 2 to 3 paramedics push past me. One leaning in the window I'm at. The others prying open the back door. When did they get there? I look up and realize 2 paramedic trucks are there. The 4th paramedic is with the driver. The off-duty cop gets out of their way. Is standing next to me for a bit. Nothing else we can do. Just let them take care of it. We chat for a bit. And then I'd just leave. No one wanted a statement or anything, or so it seemed. I wasn't able to find any info in the paper. I don't know what happened to the girls. This was in 1997. I was just a scared pizza delivery guy/college student.